with regard to immigration is being done for you, on your behalf, by your elected officials. It's a process that you've got authorship in. It's a process that, though you may not be making the decisions day in and day out, you're part of the process. And so I'm not really here to talk to you or to tell you about the Central American issue. I'm really here to see if anybody is interested in getting active. A little bit about me. I'm an attorney. I am the director of a nonprofit. If we rewind the clock and put myself in your shoes, I had no idea that law school was ahead of me. I had no idea that activism was ahead of me. And I really didn't consider myself anybody who had anything to contribute, quite frankly. I really did think that this was the job of other people, that there were folks who had the ideas, who were positioned through their families or through something that I didn't know about, that they were the ones who were involved, they were the ones who were going to be making a difference, they were the ones who got active. Maybe it's a sign of the times, maybe it's what the difference was of going to college in the 90s when, right, nothing was really happening as far as we could tell. But I just begin by talking about that because in the last 10 years that I have become more of an active person and a lawyer and part of a community of people that are trying to make change, my mind gets blown over and over again when I realize that the most powerful people that I know are young people. The people whom I meet who are young, who don't have a professional degree, who don't have experience, but who know the truth from a lie or who just know that something needs to be done, are literally the most interesting people that I ever meet. I'm fascinated by that because it took a lot of us years and school and hard knocks to even kind of get a clue. I'm amazed at how many people have a clue, and probably you know now most of what you're ever gonna know. You're there, you really are there. And I just say that because I didn't realize it. Quite frankly, I sold myself short. I think I thought that the upperclassmen, when I was an underclassman, I thought the upperclassmen knew what was going on. And then you graduate and you get in the workforce and it's the people who've been working for years who know what's going on. And when you look back on it, you realize you knew what was going on the whole time. So I say that because this really is vastly, vastly important. We could imagine 150 years ago, 200 years ago, which is not that long ago. I mean, I was born in 1977, which kind of sounds like a long time ago all of a sudden. You don't have to go that many generations or that much time back until we live in a country where there are slaves, where we live back in the days before the Civil War, and there is slavery in this country. And you could imagine a group such as us coming together and talking about these people called slaves, and that there's this thing called slavery. When we look back in history, you tend to think that everybody was involved in these historic moments. But the truth is that slavery happened, and most people just went about living their lives. Jews were rounded up in Germany, and a lot of Germans just went about living their lives, right? So the idea of kind of coming to you in this seminar kind of environment or setting and talking to you about that issue, if you could imagine a classroom of people getting together to hear a speaker talk about slavery, and that you would sit in a room and say, oh, wow, yeah, that's horrible, that's interesting. And it's the times of slavery. I mean, if you could imagine any one of us, right? Any one of us, if you had a time machine and you could rewind and put yourself right back into 1850, 1840, you'd become an abolitionist. I mean, you would just, I could only imagine, you would immediately set yourself about the task of shaking every person that you could meet on the street and saying, hey, guess what? We're all people. There was a day. There was a day when slavery was actually just this kind of side issue. Oh, wow. And there were a lot of really good people who probably thought that slaves needed slavery, or that that's just the way it was. But we know so much more now in retrospect, and it all kind of seems to, history seems to just kind of plop out like cable off of an extension cord. It just wound out. But no, each one of those moments was the culmination of hundreds, thousands of people coming up against a system, creating disruption, facing adversity, being wrong for a long time before they were right. Abolitionists were wrong in their day. They were acting outside of the law. They were criminals in their day. Crazy to think of it in retrospect, but that's what it was to be in that position. And I'm convinced you might kind of get a bit of a sense. I'm quite convinced, quite determined, that we today are sitting in that classroom. We are sitting in a classroom talking about slavery, and isn't that interesting that this is happening? But that's what's happening. Right? There are 10 to 20 million undocumented people in this country. How many of those people are being forced or frauded or coerced into doing the work that they're doing? How many people exist with no choice, no decision, no authorship about their lives? Millions, millions. We're living in a golden age of slavery today. There are potentially more slaves in the United States today than in our nation's history. And it's because the same reason that there were slaves, as we think about it, back then. Economic forces and an entire population of people left outside of the law. When you render these people illegal and you put them on the perimeter, you create a slave class. And we might think and we might say that we have overcome slavery in our country, but I tell you, we haven't. We are currently in the golden age of slavery here in the United States. You know, it makes me think about a group of people, group of guys from the 70s. You may have heard of them, kind of long hair, kind of funky, a little anti-authoritarian. Reportedly, there were even a few who grew pot in their backyards. But they changed America with their ideas. And their ideas changed the world. And I'm not talking about the Grateful Dead in the 1970s. I'm talking about our founding fathers in the 1770s. And they did something very, very interesting, I think. I'm a lawyer. I went to law school. A little bit about me, I'm a theater major who went to law school, so it can happen, guys, all right? It can happen. Law school was never even in my idea until I was out of college, so there you go. My little bit for go to law school. It's a good idea. It really is. But you get used with the law. Laws don't really read. You know, I did Shakespeare and Caribbean literature and French and all this sort of beautiful language. And then you go to law school and you start reading regulations and statutes and Supreme Court cases, and it's not exactly Shakespeare, right? It doesn't exactly have that draw. But our Constitution, pretty important document for us lawyers, begins with a poem. That's pretty interesting. That in itself is kind of weird. Not all laws begin with poems. You don't usually get a poem when you're going to law school. But we got one. We got one as a country. Our whole country was born with a poem. And I think that this says many things. I want to talk a little bit about the poem, but just the fact that our law begins with art and culture, to me as a lawyer, it puts us in our place. You know, we like to think as lawyers, we're like really important. But we know that culture and society and people are what drive change. And I think that they knew that. That's why they put a poem at the beginning. And what did the poem say at the beginning? It said, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union." Blah, 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 blah. It's a poem. It's a great poem. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. I just want to take those words. I'm in college. We'll do a close read. I want to take those words and just think about those as a beginning. We the people who started, what was it before this country existed? We the people existed. We the people put this country together. The people who were here in this country before the country existed, which was people from all over the world. people of all stations and all countries. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Well, if it's a more perfect union, that means what? They already had a union. The Constitution is ordered to make it more perfect, which means our union existed before the Constitution. And our union comes not from the government to us, not from some outside, but from us. We the people. We are the people who create this government in order to form a more perfect union. Do you know what that sounds a lot like? It sounds like community organizing to me. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. That's the essence of community organizing. That's what's happening in this room, hopefully right now, is that we the people have a hope that we can achieve a more perfect union. I'm here to talk to you about one way. I think that it's a very important way, because we know that our country is not perfect. And I'm by no means a hater of the United States. I am an immigrant to the United States. I became a United States citizen of my own choice. I love this country. But we know, going back to slavery, going back to Tom Crow, going back to the anti-China movement, not this one, but the last one, or maybe it's just been one big one, that our country is not perfect, but we have a tendency over time to increase our liberties, to include more groups into the protections that our government and our Constitution provides. That's the general course of our history. It's getting better. I don't think it's any different than any one of the other existential battles that we have fought as a nation. When we as a nation choose to cast people out of our law, when we choose to ignore entire swaths of our population, then we are not the people. We are not living up to those words of we the people, and we are not forming a more perfect union. I really, really want to invite you to be part of what we are doing, but also to, I think, to understand. And I hope that you can understand. I'm coming back to where I started in terms of how I did not feel sitting in the chair, listening to guys like me. I did not feel like I had any part in history. I didn't feel that I was needed in any way. I felt like maybe there were opportunities ahead of me that I had to figure out my path in life. What's ahead of all of you. But that was an individual journey for me of survival or getting ahead or doing what my parents told me that I had to do. What I understand now, and the only thing I want to communicate that you might remember, is that everybody has the power to change the world. It's not cheesy, it's not precious, and sometimes it's not always for the better. But your own individual capacity through your convictions, through what you know, the truth that you know to be the truth, is really meaningful. The people who are older than you don't know better than you, and people bigger than you aren't stronger than you. You absolutely are that force of change. And the only thing that's waiting is you. It's just waiting for your participation. You've got all the equipment, you've got all the talent and skills, information of anybody else out there. So it might not be for immigration. I really, really, really wish that it was, because I do think that this is really about us. I really think that how we treat immigrants in our current society, it's about us. And governments, I'm by no means anti-government, but they have a tendency to want to be in control of things. And when you want to be in control of everything, you can get a little tyrannical. We have a role of making sure that our government does not become tyrannical. That is in our Constitution. That is an American and a world idea. But when governments practice tyranny, sometimes they do it at the perimeter. Sometimes they do it with people who you might consider outcasts, deserving of that treatment, or not worth protecting. And if that's the way you look at it, that's fine. If your only interest is a self-interest, then just know that they're practicing with those people. They'll get to you eventually. And so we must, I think, as a people, come together. And I really think that it's important. I think that if we don't take action, I think we might actually lose the country that we love. The good news is that we are the people who can actually do something. It's not the Donald Trumps with the suits and the cigars and the fat cats. At the end of the day, it's the people. We have a way of surprising them at the end. It's the people. And that is you. And so, without being, I've been watching too many campaigns and I'm watching too many debates. But I harp on this because, and again, maybe I'm talking to myself 10 years ago, or I like to say 10 years ago, maybe it was 15 years ago. Because I didn't have a clue. And I'm really glad I was kind of tugged in this direction. I feel like I was tugged. I don't think that I would have necessarily, I don't think I was pointed in the direction of trying to affect change. But I've had some experiences where I feel like I've made a difference. I feel like I've made a difference in some individual lives, and I feel like I've been part of making a difference in a larger way. I think we as an organization, through our work and the fact that we're doing a lot of work on the ground, which brings voice to our arguments. I don't have to be the guy talking. You don't have to listen to the lawyer talk all day. You can listen to people who are immediately impacted by this talk about their experiences. Because I think what's so interesting and insidious and disappointing is sometimes from my perch doing immigration law, particularly here at the border, is that in representing mostly asylum seekers, so people who come to this country requesting protection from their government, basically, which asylum is. You're requesting that one government protect you from your government. And so in seeing that, I've had opportunity to write down a lot of people's reasons for fleeing their home countries. Usually they're running away from a violent individual or a government official or some group that the government can't or won't control. And what I've seen is, in many unfortunate instances, the scenes and descriptions that I'm writing down from the words of my clients about the horrible things that have been constructed in their countries being reconstructed by our government here in our country, along our border, as if to kind of create this theatrical stage where our country looks just as bad, I suppose they want people to think, as your country. So you're not going to find anything different here than what you fled in your home country. And I will give you some examples, and some of the things that Yanira mentioned and something that you brought up as well. When you first arrive seeking protection in this country, first you are met with angry, violent men with guns. First thing you're going to find. Okay? You will walk right up and you can take a taxi to the bridge and you can ask for asylum. You can cross the river and you can walk up to the nearest official. You're going to find an angry man with a gun yelling at you, calling you names, saying horrible things to you. I've heard it. I've heard it from Yanira. I've heard it from 18-year-old Somali guys at a detention center in East Texas. I've heard it from 40-year-old Honduran women from a detention center in South Texas. Different people, different times, same experience. Meeting very angry American officials with guns at the border. What are many of these people fleeing? They're fleeing governments. They're fleeing crooked cops. And who are the people that they're supposed to pour their hearts out to immediately upon being arrested and explain in detail their asylum claims? These angry men with guns. These are the people that they're supposed to explain. Hey, I'm fleeing my husband who's been raping me for the past 10 years. That's what you're supposed to explain to this guy. So we have that. Then we bring you into something called the hielera, which in English means the icebox or the cooler. And these are container boxes, okay? Container boxes, like on the back of a train or in a Merc ship that you see. A container box with an AC attached to it. Well, they will put women and children and men for days on end until they sign their deportation orders. This is right out of what I hear happening in Eritrea to my Eritrean clients who get brought into the military, which is a mandatory military participation in Eritrea. Mandatory 2 years, that never ends. You never get out of the military in Eritrea. And if you're caught reading a Bible in the military unit, what do? They stick you in a refrigerated container box. Well, we've got those too now. And they're all over our southern border. Valfurias, Laredo. These are not border patrol stations. These are not offices. These are not official. You will never hear anybody talk about them except the people who stay in them. Then they bring them to the perero, the kennel, right? Which basically is a warehouse that we have rented, that we have lined interior with chain link fencing, creating a matrix and a labyrinth of rooms, all with chain link fence. So why? So that we don't have to hire too many guards. So you can put a guard in each corner and they can see all the way through the room. No individual rooms. You don't have to get a guard for each room. And they separate the mom and the kids. That's when Yanira was separated from her children for the first time since they were violently separated in Mexico, which you can imagine what that does. We've recreated that too. And then where do we plop them? We prop them in a for-profit prison where they have to pay $7,000, $15,000. We've had to deal with up to $20,000 in bond payments that women have had to pay to get out. What does that sound like? It's what the Zetas do. It's what the Zetas do in Mexico. They put women and children in a box until they pay enough money to get out. Except the Zetas don't charge as much. We have recreated inside of our own government for their pleasure, for their deterrent pleasure, every experience from which they have fled, everything that we criticize about in other governments. I actually heard a BBC World Service story the other night talking about family detention centers in Thailand for women and children from Pakistan. And the British reporter was, like a list of horribles, was talking about all the things that happen in these horrible exotic centers. Every single one of those things happens right here. Then the community of advocates sued the hell out of the government because guess what? It's super illegal to put children in prisons. Guess what? Super illegal to put kids in prisons and has been for like 20 years. But our government realized something, that they could probably do it for about a year or two before the law caught up. That it takes a while before courts take action. And they knew full well that it was illegal, but they did it anyway because they, in a year and a half, could send a lot of deterrent messages. And so they did. But we caught up with them. The wheel of justice is slow, but it catches up. And it caught up, and we finally put some constraints on them, legal constraints, that they can't keep women and children indefinitely in a prison. Wow. Who would have thunk? And so as a result of that, they were forced to have lower time in detention. Okay? So the detention private company said, oh no, that's less money for us. Our business model is people in detention, not people getting out of detention. Do you think it's a good thing that a mega billion-dollar corporation in America needs people in detention in order to make its money? Does that make you feel safe? It shouldn't. It should not make you feel safe. No. That an industry within our economy requires people in boxes in order to survive, that should not make you feel safe. They see what? They see coming criminal justice reform. They see the government trying to lower the number of people in prison in the United States. Guess what their response is? Let's put immigrants in prison. Nobody cares about them yet. And then when they were forced by a judge to keep less immigrants in prison, they thought, let's get into the ankle monitor business. So the prison company got into the ankle monitor business. And they got a big, sweet contract with the government for ankle monitors, and so now every woman and child that gets out, Yanira got out before this program began, they slap a big ankle monitor, or a grillete, shackle, on the women. The people who work at the company call them grilletes. They call them shackles at the company. And these devices are heavy, they're rubber, they're bulky, you can barely get pants on and off. They send a signal to anybody who looks at you that I'm a what? I'm a criminal, I'm dangerous. But this is a woman. This is a woman refugee. And so what we've seen is that whenever the opportunity to engage in an expensive enforcement regime as opposed to a cheaper protective regime, because let's be clear, we could as a country for like half the money provide services to the refugees. The only negative consequence to that is that they would all win their cases and they would actually become Americans. So our government prefers to spend more money on an enforcement regime that ends up in deportation than it does on a protection regime that ends up in welcoming and incorporating new Americans into the country. Fear sells better than sex. In the 80s, they figured out how much sex sells. Now we've figured out how much fear sells. It sells a lot of product. And so I don't know. I think that, the immigration courts are still inside of the Department of Justice. The judges work for the Department of Justice. Now there's a big movement actually to move the courts out of the Department of Justice into becoming actual courts, right? The so-called immigration courts are actually administrative tribunals. It's like a court-martial, it's like Gitmo, it's all under the executive. It's not under the third article of the Constitution, courts. They're not courts as we understand them. So there's a big move to actually make them courts to get a bit of independence. Because an immigration judge who grants too many asylum cases, DHS files complaints against them until the Department of Justice fires them. So I think also the Department of Health and Human Services also actually has a big role to play in this. And I actually think that in terms of asylum law and the protection of refugees and asylum seekers, where I think there's a real strong nexus to the body, because a lot of the harms, emotional, psychological, and physical, are manifest in the body. And I think the Health and Human Service mandate of serving towards the health of the body actually would maybe identify it as a potential department also to house some of the asylum protections that are currently under Department of Homeland Security. That's a good question, though. I mean, we made the Department of Homeland Security real quick. That just like happened real fast, and it's one of the biggest departments in our government now.
So there was like a asylum process prior to 9/11. Like people would sometimes come into New York and then they would wait a while, get their trial, etc.
Yeah.
Is that totally gone now? And like everyone, whether you're from Central America or if you're from Somalia, you get shoveled into these boxes and then detention camps, or are we just particularly targeting people from Latin America, Central America?
Yes, we are particularly targeting people from Latin America and Central America. What's interesting is that currently many people, in fact potentially a majority of people who come to the border seeking asylum get released. It's the lucky few or the unlucky few who actually get put into detention. Because detention itself, as I said, it's a deterrent strategy. It's a form of theater. It seeks to send a message. And so the government doesn't detain everybody because you don't have to detain everybody to send that message. And they don't have the money to detain everybody. So in fact, many Central Americans actually get released at the border with a notice to show up at court. And in fact, of the 121 people who were victims of the raids that happened in the first weekend of the year, all but 2 families had been released at the border. Most of the people who were victims of the raids had been released at the border. Only 2 families had been in family detention. And so many Africans, many folks, if a pregnant African woman shows up at the border, Border Patrol calls me on my cell phone and says, hey, we got another one, can we put her on a bus? Do you guys have room in the shelter? And I say, yeah, bring her on up. So it's very selective, it's very random, and that's another troubling part of the whole process. Now you hit upon something so important, I'll take a couple seconds to talk about. You talked about 9/11 and how things were before and after. The law has not changed. Law hasn't changed. Now the laws did change in 96, again under a not Republican president. So my partisanship, I'm not, the partisanship does not fall in the usual way, and nor can we say that any one party is the party of this group or not, because you have to watch all parties when it comes to immigration. Everybody gets the short end of the stick. But what happened after 9/11 was a huge administrative change. We moved our immigration controls very, very mundanely. Right? As an Irish citizen back in the day, I used to know. You used to get on the airplane in Ireland, you'd get off at JFK, and you'd go through immigration at JFK. That's where you had to walk through the blue line or the green line or whatever, the red line. Well, now after 9/11, we moved all those controls to the European destination departures. So you went through U.S. immigration before getting on the airplane. So we have this image of like Baryshnikov, the famous Russian dancer, dancing off the jetway in JFK seeking asylum. Baryshnikov couldn't get on that airplane anymore because they controlled at the departure. So when our immigration service made that change, immediately after 9/11, that began a huge change in the movement of internationally displaced people around our world. And what we saw was a shift from refugees coming to our country over the air into LAX and JFK to folks getting to South America, from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, and then traveling up through Central America and Mexico to come to the Texas border. And that is why, little did I know it when I started working in this industry in 2004, that the world had changed, and we were about to see Texas now become the major port of entry for internationally displaced people into the United States. The Laredo port of entry is one of, I'm sure Syria has probably put us to shame now, but has been historically one of the busiest borders for internationally displaced people on Earth, Laredo. And so a majority of our work, you would think, South Texas immigration lawyer, you're working with Mexican people. No. It's the whole world.